Hey y'all, welcome back to In the Kitchen with Baker Girl. Thank you, Jesus. It is another beautiful day to be in the kitchen, and today I am really excited because in today's video I will show you how to can new baby potatoes, and I'm going to be using a pressure cooker. Now I don't have the nerves or the know-how to use to do water bath canning for potatoes, so I'm gonna go the route that makes me feel safer by using a pressure canner. And this is a whopping old pressure canner, but this thing, I have canned many veggies in it, many veggies. And if you're canning any vegetable, which is a low acid vegetable, such as potatoes, green beans, anything like that, you do need a pressure canner. And no worries, if you know nothing about pressure canning, or if you're just curious, want to know how it works, I'll take you through the process of how it works. It's really just common sense canning, no more than any other cooking that we'll be doing. So stay tuned. Before we get started, don't forget to like and subscribe, and let's jump into the video. Now, before I get going into all of the canning equipment and potatoes and all those things, I do want to just give you an alert. This is not a 10-minute video. There is no way I can give you a breakdown, and I'm not just giving you a gloss over. I like to give you a breakdown on things like this because if you're a beginner, you need to know the steps that it takes to do these things properly. And if you already know, feel free to skip ahead on to the full video. So I'm going to give you some step-by-steps. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Because like I say, canning is not a 10 or 15 minute process. And I don't ever want to give somebody the illusion that this is, 15 minutes and you're done. It is not. Jams take 40, 45 minutes, but canning is usually done over a process of several hours. Whether it's water bath canning or pressure canning, none of it is done in 10 or 15 minutes. So I don't want to give you the illusion that this is something that's speedy. When it is speedy, quick, and easy, I'll let you know. When it takes some time and it's worth your investment of time, I'll let you know that too. Now, like I said, today we're using a pressure canner, and this is an older pressure canner. And the reason why I keep it, because it still works, there's no reason to get rid of it, but also because this is one of the few pressure canners that you find that is tall enough for you to double up. And what I mean is, because of the height of this pressure canner and the width of it, it is large enough for you to, if you're using, say, pint jars, you can put 2 of them in at a time, like that. And then you put your lid on and you can double up. So you can put 2 layers of jars into this pressure canner. And also it holds 7 quart-sized jars. Now you can't double up the quarts, but it does hold 7 of these quarts. And when you're canning, you want to make the most use when you're batch per batch. You know what I mean? Like, you don't want to have to can 3 jars and wait, 2 hours and then come back and do that. Could be very tedious. So a larger canner with a good amount of depth and a good amount of width that will hold many jars is always a good thing. The only drawback to these size canners is they do take some time to come up to pressure, and they can put a lot of weight on your stove. That's and also they are kind of heavy. But other than that, I love my old pressure canner. I've had this one for, oh my goodness, I don't know, many years. And I actually bought it used. So let me give you a primer about pressure canners if you have never used one or you've never seen one. So they have a very heavy lid. And the lid on the inside, it has this seal ring. It's just like an Instant Pot. If you're familiar with an Instant Pot, it has a seal ring. And you always want to make sure that your seal ring is in good condition, because if your seal ring is cracked or it's damaged, your pot will not come up to pressure and you'll just aggravate yourself because it won't do anything. So always check your seal ring. And this pressure canner, I use a weighted gauge, and what this does is when the pot comes up, when it's ready, when it comes and all the steam has vented out of the pot, that's called venting. And you would put your weighted gauge on top. And what that does is that literally stops the steam from coming out. And pressure after you vented the pot because you're letting all of the excess air blow out of the pot. This prevents any excess air from coming in or going out of the pot. And after that happens, the pressure begins to build up in the pot. And how you know your pressure is building up, this pot has a digital gauge. And the gauge moves over just like a dial, just like a speedometer on a car, but it does move slowly. And it goes from 0 pounds of pressure to 5 pounds to 10 pounds to 15 pounds PSI. And then, of course, it goes on over. Now, I have never canned anything that has gone over 11 to 12 pounds of pressure. When you go over beyond that, you really are canning, not just basic things. Maybe you're canning fish. I think fish is the only thing that's canned at very high pressure. But most vegetables are canned at about 10 and 11 pounds of pressure. And that is what I'm going to be canning my potatoes at, 11 pounds of pressure. So this dial has 10 pounds PSI on it. And then right beside it is another little gauge. That's your 11 gauge. Now, if you're curious as to what all that means in terms of temperature, 10 pounds of pressure is 240 degrees on the inside of this pot. Now, why do we use a pressure canner? A water bath canner will not go above 212 degrees because water will not go over 212 degrees. 212 degrees is the max temperature for boiling water, and the temperature of water will never climb more than that in a regular pot. So to increase the pressure, you use a pressure canner because the pressure canner seals itself in. No steam escapes. None comes in and none goes out. So the pressure begins to build because that boiling water has nowhere to go. And that is the only thing that makes that pressure climbs up, is using a pressure canner. Now, are pressure canners dangerous? Any sort of cooking, any sort of pot is dangerous. Frying can be dangerous. Making caramel can be dangerous because caramel can hit 340 degrees. So this pot is only at 240 degrees. So you can imagine the difference between this and caramel if you're thinking in terms of safety. I mean, caramel is screaming hot. But as with any type of cooking, canning, anything, you got to use common sense safety measures. I was nervous about pressure canning until I read this book, and I did read up on a lot of books. And this lady, she commented, she said, people are worried about, pressure cannings blowing up and all that kind of stuff. And she said, will you ever put a pressure canner full of jars on the stove, crank the heat up to high, and then go off to the movies? She said, will you have problems? She said, yeah, I think you will have problems. But she was like, as long as you're in the kitchen watching it, the gauge tells you what's going on inside the pot. So there's no need to worry if your canner is sound, your gauge is accurate, you're paying attention, you're listening, you're watching, you're not going to have any trouble because you're not going to crank the heat up to high and walk away. As a matter of fact, the temperature on the stove is lower for a pressure canner than it is in a boiling water canner, because boiling water, you need to have the heat on relatively high so the water continues to boil. But with the pressure canner, once this canner hits the correct PSI, which is 11 pounds for the potatoes we're doing today, you will turn that heat down to low. As a matter of fact, in some cases, to maintain an even pressure, you can cut the heat off entirely. And the pot will stay at that temperature. And then you just watch it. If you see, if you're like, okay, I think I need to cut that heat back on, turn it back on. But we'll keep it at low, because you can't turn the heat up to high on these things for a long amount of time. So that's the difference between a pressure canner and a water bath canner. It's just as safe as any other pot or anything in the kitchen that you would be using. So no need to be nervous. Use the same common sense that you use when you're doing any kind of cooking, and read books. So I am using today the Ball Canning book. This is what me and my mom used to use. And if you don't have one of these, you should get one, because it tells you all about canning different things, from fruits to fruit juices, to high acid foods such as jams and jellies and pickles. It goes over to preserves. Then it goes over to from pickled foods. It heads over into low acid foods. It tells you how to can meat. It tells you how to can everybody's favorite, green beans. And then it gives you different foods that you can can. Okra, black-eyed peas, corn, tomatoes is also in your low acid category. And today, white or Irish potatoes. So the Ball Canning book says for 2 to 3 pounds of white potatoes per quart. So it says all you need is potatoes, you need salt, and you need water. And you're good. So once we jump to the ingredients, I'll jump into the instructions on how to... Oh, look, I was wrong. Okay, so you process the jars at 10 pounds of pressure, not 11. I think I had always got myself into the habit of pressure canning at 11 pounds of pressure just to be safe. But Ball says 10 pounds of pressure. So 10 pounds of pressure it shall be. Equipment. We need jars, of course. I'm using quart-sized jars. You can use the pint jars. But again, it all depends on your use. If you know you would only use this amount, then use this amount. But if you know, say you cook more potatoes or you have a larger family, or you want like some for soup or whatever, use a larger jar. And I'll be using quarts today. And then, of course, you need your jar lifter. You need a canning wand, which gets the air out of the jars. And you need a funnel to put over the jar so you can get your food in safely. You need a ladle, which I did not bring out, but you do need a ladle. And of course, you need lids for your jars, 2-piece lids, washed and clean. And everything is washed and sterilized and ready to go. That is your basic canning equipment. As I showed in a previous video, I did pickled eggs. I'll link that in the iCards for the pickled eggs. Also, I'll link you to the video for canned strawberry jam. All of this equipment, once you buy it, minus the jars, because you need new jars, but once you buy these things, you don't need to buy them again because you can use them over and over again. And I do have a stock pot of boiling water on the stove because we need to par-cook our potatoes. So now, let's talk about the potatoes. Now, for potatoes, in here, I have 7 pounds of baby potatoes, and they have been peeled and they have been washed. Now, yes, this takes time, but it's not really safe to can potatoes with the peelings on them because even though you can scrub and scrub and scrub, you'll never get every little speck of dirt out of potatoes. Not to mention the time it takes you to sit there furiously scrubbing those potatoes. You could just go ahead and peel them. It'll take you the same amount of time. Besides, it's more use out of them than having to take them out of the jars and get the peels off of them. So they're peeled. And these are called new potatoes because of their size. They're very small. And these I just left whole. But I did separate them from the larger potatoes over here, which are these size. And this would be a little complicated getting into a jar. So I cut the larger ones up into smaller pieces just because you can't get those giant potatoes in the jar. And keep your potatoes in cold water. Keep them submerged in cold water. That just keeps them from turning brown. So we are going to par-cook these potatoes in boiling water. Now, yes, they will be going into the pressure canner, but raw packed potatoes is tricky because it takes that's a lot of density for the heat to penetrate all the way through that very dense jar, and you can end up with some of the potatoes in the very center not being done very well, and then some of them on the outside being a little overcooked. Not to mention that takes way more time because you're raw packing, and anytime you're raw packing something, you have to add more time so that that food properly cooks all the way through. So I'm going to just take the easiest route, which is cook these on the stove in boiling water. And then you want some fresh water because, of course, once your potatoes are cooked, you'll put them in the jar and then we'll fill each jar with fresh, clean, boiling water. So those are the two things you need: a pot, 2 pots if you have them. I actually have some boiling water in my Instant Pot just to give me a little extra room on my stove. So I just put some water in my Instant Pot, brought it to the boil, and that's sitting there waiting that I can ladle into my jars. So I'm going to cook these potatoes in my stock pot, plain water, and I'm going to cook them for about 10 minutes. You want them to not be raw, but you do not want them to be anywhere near done by any means. I'll show you what I mean when they come out of the can. So here we are at the stove, and my water is boiling nicely. And I'm just going to start off with my baby potatoes. So just get those in and let those boil. Okay, and get those in. And let them start to boil a little, parboil pretty much. And you can see how they're already changing color. So get a lid on and let those begin the process. So while this is going, let's go back to the canning book, the ball canning book, and let's talk a little bit about potatoes and canning potatoes. So it says 2 to 3 pounds of white potatoes per quart. I'm not entirely sure how you can put 3 pounds of potatoes in a quart jar, but that's what they said. But we'll see. We shall see. Salt and then water. Those are your basic ingredients. So it says wash your potatoes, drain, then peel your potatoes, which we've already done. Wash again. Leave small potatoes whole. So we did that. Cut larger potatoes into quarters. We did that too. Cover potatoes with water in a large sauce pot, which is what we have here. Boil for 10 minutes. Pack hot potatoes into hot jars, leaving 1-inch headspace. Now, my jars are not hot. The reason why my jars are not hot is because everything that's going into these jars will be hot. Now, I know in my other video when I was canning the strawberry jam, hot jars, hot food go into hot jars and into hot water. But the water in the pressure canner will not be hot. So therefore, I don't have to worry about my jars being hot because the ingredients that are going into the jars will be hot and the water will be hot. And that will instantly warm up the jars, and it'll be safe to put them into the pressure canner because the pressure canner is not going to be hot. So you get what I mean? If the water in the pressure canner was hot, you wouldn't want those jars to be hot. But since I am putting hot potatoes and hot water into those jars, then going into just a room temperature pressure canner, it'll be fine. Now, while the potatoes are boiling, I'm going to go ahead and add my salt into my jars. So I'm using Morton's pickling and canning and pickling salt. And I'm going to add 1 teaspoon per jar as instructed. Okay, so I've got my salt in, and I see one of my pots is coming up to the boil, the other pot is coming up to the boil, so this is moving along pretty good. Thank you, Jesus. So the potatoes have come up to the they've come up to the boil, and they have cooked for 9 minutes. Now I'm going to check on them, and I'm actually going to use a cake tester. So I'm just going to, oh, that's good. That's really good. So let's go ahead and kill the heat and get them out of this pot immediately because I don't want them to overcook at this stage. All right, we're back. Now it's time to get the potatoes in the jars. Now I kept my potatoes covered while the water was reheating, while the water was heating, because you don't want them to start to cool off. You do want them to be hot as possible. Now let me grab my ladle, and I'm going to start off with doing 1 jar at a time. So got my jar funnel. Now I'm going to start and ladle 1 ladle full of water in the hot water very hot water at the bottom of the jar. That's just to dissolve the salt. Then I'm going to start adding some potatoes. So in she goes. And just ladle them in. You can use your fingers. As a matter of fact, I think clean fingers. I use my clean fingers to get them in here. If you hear noise in the background, there is some work being done on the roof. So that's why you hear a little noise running around in the background. Always give the jar a little shake and see how you can fit them in. I think that's perfect. Okay. And then ladle in some water. Daddy is painting the roof. So it has to be done every so many years. And so it's a lot of noise and a lot of progress work that goes sometimes fast and sometimes slow. Okay. Now let me just take my jar one, stick it down in there, make sure I get out any air bubbles. And you always need to top off. Let me grab a spoon. You always need to usually top off a jar. Sometimes you'll find that you have one potato too many, so I'll take that one back out because that does happen. Once you add your water in there, the level changes. Now remember, we do want to be cautious about headspace. So let me step back and look. The headspace is fine. Okay. So wipe the rims. Add on a lid. And the lid is just fingertip tight. It's not like tight. It's just fingertip tight. Set that jar aside. You do want to move fairly quickly though when you're doing this because your jars are everything starts to cool once you take it off the heat. So just move relatively quickly. And by the way, I did say earlier the water was not heated in the pressure canner before we put the jars, but actually I do have the water heating just because to make sure everything stays hot, because you don't want things to start to cool down. It increases your jars cracking, and also it takes a lot longer. So correction, do have the water warm. It doesn't have to be boiling, but it should just be warm. Okay, now ladle in some more water. And one thing I do want to say about canning days, you always want to give yourself a little bit extra understanding, because when you are canning, that kind of takes up everything that you're doing. So canning days, unless you're a pro canner, which I'm not, canning days to me are reserved just for canning. That's what I'm doing that day. And so always keep in mind about such things as, you want to make sure if you eat during the day or if you snack or whatever you want to snack, have snacks prepared so you're not stressed about, what are you going to eat or whatever. And also, thanks potato, and also have dinner prepared. So perhaps make, dinner ahead, or consider canning day an order out day or something like that. I can't believe I'm actually encouraging ordering out, but hey, it's fine if you do. There's nothing wrong with ordering out. We don't typically, but it's understandable on canning days if you do. So just keep that in mind on canning. That minimizes you stressing about, what's for dinner, and because I've done it. Believe me, I've done it before. It's like you're trying to can, and then, of course, everybody's still got to eat. And it just creates a little bit of a headache for you. So to save yourself some time, just kind of plan ahead for those canning days. Okay. And I see here I have one potato too many. So I'm going to get you out. And I'm going to wipe the rims and just continue until I get all my potatoes in the jars. This is fun. All right, I've got all the potatoes in the jars. Everybody is in the jars. The lids are on, nice and firm. Now it's time to load each jar into the pressure canner. A little bit of a squeeze. One goes in the middle. And there we are. So everybody is in the pressure canner. And you can see, now I did put about 2 to 3 inches of water into the bottom of the pressure canner. Because you have so many jars in here, the water level will rise. And one thing I do want to add to the water, and you do want to add this, is just maybe about 2 tablespoons of white vinegar. That's because there's so much pressure. I might as well add all that in there. Because of the high pressure, your jars will look kind of murky and a little bit cloudy. So you just want to add that vinegar, keeps your jars clear, and they don't turn murky looking. Because of the high pressure, they will. So now I'm going to go ahead and put my lid on. And now this canner has an arrow that needs to align with the pot in order for it to close up properly. So that's aligned and the jar is locked. Thank you, Jesus. No more to do. And now we're going to start to bring the pressure up in the pot. So I will turn the pot up to high to medium high. And it will not build pressure at this point because the gauge, the weighted gauge is not on there. So if we were to put this on, the pot would start to build pressure. But we don't want to do that at this point because there's still a lot of air inside of this pot. And so when the water in it comes up to the boil, steam will start to come up out of this little ring spout here. Steam will start to bellow out just like a steam kettle. When that happens, you set a timer for 10 minutes and you let that steam vent out of that pot for 10 full minutes. What that does is that gets rid of all that excess air inside the pressure canner. After 10 minutes, then we put our weighted gauge on top, and that stops the steam from coming out and allow pressure to start to build. So at this point, nothing is happening. There's not a lot of steam in here. The water is not boiling. That could take anywhere from maybe about 15 minutes for this canner to come up to where it's venting. So I'll show you what that looks like then. So now the pressure canner has come up and it's venting. As you can see the steam coming out and you can hear it. You hear that little whistling? So that's what we want. We want that little whistling noise. You want to see that steam coming up out of the pot. You can see the steam coming out. If you look closely, you can see the steam. That's what we want. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to set a timer. I'm going to go ahead and set a timer for 10 minutes. So 10 minutes and let's go. And we're going to let this vent for 10 minutes because that's necessary to get all that excess air out of the pressure canner. So that's going to go for 10 minutes and we'll come back. The 10 minutes is up. The pot is fully vented. Now I'm going to go ahead and add my gauge to it. I'm just going to set that right on top. Now, when I put that on there, the pressure in the pot, you hear the sound change? Now the pressure in the pot is starting to build. This is the point where you do not want to walk away for any reason whatsoever. So no answering the phone, no going to the bathroom. I'm sorry. This is the point when you need to pay attention. This pressure is starting to build and I'll show you what that looks like. So as you can see here, the pressure gauge is starting to move over. So before we put the pressure gauge on, it was at 0. Now the pressure gauge is starting to climb because the pressure in the pot is starting to climb. So as I say, don't walk away, don't leave, don't panic, but just watch the gauge. When the pressure gauge gets over to 10, then before you get to 10, you want to start reducing your heat. You're reducing your heat because you don't want the pressure to climb over 10. If it climbs over 10, that still doesn't count. So You want to just watch it when it gets to 10. When it gets to 10, that is when we start regulating the heat, and then we'll set our timer at the 40-minute mark to start to cook. So that's when the canning actually begins, when your pressure gauge hits 10. Okay, so our pressure gauge is just getting to 10 pounds of pressure. Now I'm going to literally kill the heat. And I'm going to go down to, that is, so I have an electric stove and it has these rings in it when you have the largest. This one just has an extra ring around it. So I'm actually going to go to this size ring, because as you can see, we have hit spot on 10 pounds of pressure. Now, this is the time when you, I'm going to watch my arm here, when you set your timer for 40 minutes and you start counting. So now we are at the correct pressure. We start counting 40 minutes. Now, does that mean that because the pressure is correct, we can now walk away? No, because the temperature in a pressure canner needs to be constantly monitored so you can keep it regulated. For instance, turning it down to the lowest setting could be too low and the pressure could start to drop. Then I'm going to have to go back up to a higher pressure, add a little bit of higher temperature to keep that pressure so that it stays. It's kind of like driving a car and you have the gas pedal. Sometimes you can put it on cruise control and just go, but most of the time going up and down, that the needle, you know how the gauge, the odometer goes up and down, you have to give it a little bit more gas, a little light gas. So think about pressure canning in the same sense. Keep my eye on it. Think about the pressure canner and the heat temperature and the gauge the same way you would think of the gas pedal on a car. Sometimes you need to add a little bit more gas. Sometimes you need to let up to keep your speed, whether it's the speed limit is 55 or 60 or 70 or whatever. You just can't put your foot on full pedal and then, neither can you just take your foot off. So think about the pressure canner the same exact way. Now, what happens if the pressure drops? And this is important. This is very important. If the pressure drops in your pressure canner, say you had to go to the bathroom, which by the way, if you need to use the phone or whatever, you can do that. You just don't want to go away. But I mean, obviously you need to get some water or something. You can do that at this point. But what if I did go to the fridge to get a glass of water or something, and I come back and I realize my pressure has dropped? It has not, but I'm just saying, if my pressure has dropped and I'm now like at 9 pounds of pressure or 8 pounds of pressure if I've stayed away for a while, what do? The first thing I do is I look at the timer. So let's just say it's 20 minutes. And I looked at the timer. I am at 20 minutes and I'm down to pressure gauges. So what I do is I write down that 20 minutes, so I keep a mental note of the 20 minutes. By the way, if you have a pen and paper handy when you're pressure canning, it goes a lot better if you do. So what I do at that point, I keep that 20 minutes in mind. Then I turn the heat up, bring the pot back up to 10 pounds of pressure, and then start back up at 20 minutes. So that can take, the time it takes for your pot to come back to pressure could take 5 minutes. It could take 10 minutes depending on how low your pressure has dropped. But you do not want to count that time. You pause that 20 minutes, bring that pot back up to pressure. When it comes up to the pressure, restart your timer and continue on that way. Now, you do not want your pot to be dropping up and down in pressure. That's not ideal. Number one, it just pushes your canning time further and further out, and it just extends it when it's not necessary. It can become cumbersome too, because you're constantly, it's taking you longer than you would like. And this should not be stressful, by the way. You do need to pay attention, you need to be on your toes and all that, but it shouldn't be a stressful thing. So keeping an eye on it helps you in the long run because you're not under stress. So my pot is maintaining 10 pounds of pressure right now, and I don't have to worry about it because I will stay here. I have a chair set up, and I actually have my Bible sitting here so I can get a little reading in while I'm canning, because sometimes you don't always have, tons of time. But while I'm watching my pressure gauge, I can be doing something useful. But that's how you want to just look at it, make sure everything is correct, and go on. And come back maybe I would say check it maybe every 5-minute intervals. And your pressure canner will be fine. You don't need to touch it. You don't need to do anything. Only thing you need to watch at this point is the pressure gauge and the temperature on the dial on your stove regulating the heat. That is all. For 40 minutes, I don't need to do anything. I can go wash some dishes and just, keep looking. I can fold up some clothes and keep looking, but you don't need to do anything. So you can see pressure canning is very safe if you follow the correct steps, if you pay good attention, and if you use the same common sense that you use with any cooking. I'm not gonna go to town while this is going, so just use common sense. One thing I do want to say, you do want to make sure though that you put enough water in the pot so that the pot does not ever run dry. Now 40 minutes is not enough time for the pot to run dry at this point. That's just not going to happen. But there are some things that even in pressure canning, it is a long time in canning, such as meat, fish in particular. I have canned greens in a pressure canner, which the Lord willing I will never do again, because that is tedious and very long-winded to say the least. But there are some recipes where I've never had it happen to me, thank the Lord, but I have heard of some people whose pressure canner actually went dry. That's just because they weren't mindful of their water levels. So you do want to make sure that you the water should come up to the shoulders or to the neck of your jars. And that way you'll always have enough water. Anything below that, I would make sure I'm at the shoulder or the neck of the jars. But other than that, I'm going to keep my temperature gauge and let the potatoes go. All right, we are at 3 minutes and the pressure canner has been holding steady, but I'm just going to let that go until it's time to turn it off, which will be in 2 minutes and 30 seconds. There goes the timer. All right. Ooh, thank the Lord. That feels like a long 40 minutes. Actually, it's a lot quicker than most things, though, to be honest. Okay, so now at this point, we're done canning. I'm just going to turn off the heat. And I'm not going to do anything to the pot itself. I'm just going to pick it up and move it over off of this heat because it'll just continue to cook. We don't want it to continue to cook. There we are. We don't want it to continue to cook at this point. We just want to get it off the heat. Now, there is no quick way to drop the pressure in a pressure canner. This isn't like an Instant Pot where you can, move the vent and kind of let off. You can't do that with this thing because it can cause your jars to crack or do something weird, and you don't want to meddle with these things. Like I say, respecting pressure canners is important. You don't want to meddle with them. So I'm just going to take it off the heat and just leave it. And how the pressure is released, the pressure gauge goes down to 0. That's how there's no more pressure in the pot. Until that happens, don't try to open or do anything. I know one time I wasn't paying any attention whatsoever, and I had been canning a lot of stuff one day, and I was running my mouth talking to my mom, and I came back after, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 minutes, and I'm thinking in my mind, of course the pressure has dropped. So I'm trying to open the thing, and the thing wouldn't open, and I'm like, and I'm twisting with all I had, and then I know it had to be the Lord was like, Sarah, look at the pressure gauge. And I looked at the pressure gauge and there was still pressure in the pot. I told my mother, I said, oh, thank you, Jesus. I said, Mama, if that thing had not done what it's supposed to do, it's not supposed to open. It's supposed to refuse to open if there's pressure in the pot. But what if it had? I would have literally blown myself up because that is exactly what would have happened. So do not bother with this until the pressure drops. And also, too, the pot will be very easy to open with just a flick of your fingers when it's time for the pressure to drop. And be sure to remove the weighted gauge after the pressure has dropped and you know you're ready to open. Take the weighted gauge off first. And if there's any coming out, you know, there's still something in there. So take the gauge off. Look at the, well, first look at the pressure gauge, make sure it's at 0, take that off, and then you're free to open the pot. Now, the pressure dropping in these things can take a long time. So at this point, it's good to just put it or leave it here and forget about it and let the pressure drop, and then we'll come back. So we'll come back when the pressure drops, and I will open it up and we'll see what we have inside. All right, so the pressure gauge now says 0. And so now we can take the weighted gauge off. Actually, I'm going to use the oven mitts. Sometimes these things are hot. Okay. No steam coming out. All right. So let's open the pot. Okay. So you're going to be careful. And if the pot resists at all, stop. So let's see. Okay. You're resisting. Good. Okay. Oh, thank you, Jesus. You should pray a prayer when you open these things because they are a little tricky. Okay. So always open it with the steam tilted away from you. Ooh. I hear some hissing. The jars are still bubbling and hissing. Excellent. You see how they're still hissing and bubbling? But they are done. And as you can see, the water level did not drop from right around the shoulders. So that's a good thing. We have enough water. Now it's time to carefully lift them out of the pot. So now I'm just going to, actually I think I'm gonna put on, I always like to put on an oven mitt whenever I've got my hands over hot jars like this. It's just better to do so. All right. Ooh, thank you, Jesus. Out comes the first jar. Ooh, so much fun when these kinds of things come out well, because you know it's not just, this is not just fun, this is real. I mean, you know, this is food. Food that can feed your family for, you know, a year or so if you can enough of it. By the way, I am batch canning today, so I actually have my pots set up, and as soon as I get these out of the way, I'm gonna put a second batch in the canner. So that's the fun thing about canning. You can, if you have set aside a day for canning, just can on. That's what me and Mama would do. We would, one batch goes out, the next batch is ready to go in. Okay, so set these over here. Ooh, now you don't want fans and direct air blowing on the jars when they come out of the pressure canner, because, or any water bath canner, or anything that you can, it causes the temperature to plummet a little too quickly in the food. So just let them cool in a place away from, free from drafts, no fans and whatnot going. Just let them cool. You hear the jars begin to pop, and you hear little pop, pop, pop noises. And once they've cooled, you want to check the seal after 24 hours. So after 24 hours, just remove the ring. And then if you can pick the jar up simply by the lid, and it holds good, you're good to go. And don't forget to remove the rings, because the rings, after the jar has sealed, not yet, but after the jar has sealed, I usually wait about 2 days. And after 2 days, and I know my jars are sealed and I know the seal is good, what I do then, I remove the rings, wipe the jar off with a nice damp kitchen towel, and then put them away down the cellar. You don't need the rings anymore. Remove the rings, because the rings will create rust buildup around your jar, and that's not what you want. So take the rings off 2 days after you know you have a good seal. And just like that, we're done. Thank you, Jesus. We are done. Now, as I said earlier, I did a second batch and I did the pint size because I like to do my canning in terms of how I know we're going to eat. Some days you might want a larger jar. Some days you might want a smaller jar for, say, one thing, maybe like just to throw a few potatoes and some soup. And then another day, the potatoes could be the main event. So here, that's where the larger jars come in at. But either way, canning potatoes, potatoes themselves is a good introduction to pressure canning because compared to some things that take a lot of time and a lot of prep work, potatoes, minus the peeling, doesn't actually take a ton of prep work. And you can find canned potatoes in the grocery store, and that's not really something that a lot of us think about. Canning potatoes, we all love, green beans and corn and all those things. Canning potatoes is not quite what everybody think of when you think of canning. But you see how simple and how easy it is to can these potatoes. Now, these jars have cooled. And even though they're still warm, but they're not hot. Now, these jars are still very hot because they haven't too long ago came out of the canner. And I added a few fresh thyme sprigs into these jars just to give them a little extra flavor. You can add peppercorns, you can add rosemary, you can add a few bay leaves, but it's not necessary. I just added them in there because I know I like potatoes with thyme. We do in this house anyway. If I had rosemary, I would add rosemary, or you can just leave them plain. One thing about adding the thyme, it does lend your potatoes more so towards more super savory, such as soups and stews. Whereas these can be used for potato salad because they don't have any extra flavoring. They don't have any flavoring to them, just a little bit of salt. So I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you have, give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel. And I hope that you are inspired to, break that ice and either pull out your pressure canner or go and invest in a pressure canner. And a pressure canner is an investment. No doubt about it. They are not necessarily the cheapest canners compared to a water bath canner. Pressure canner is a little bit more, they do cost a little bit more, but once you buy them, you have them. And it's just like any of your canning equipment. Once you buy it, you have it. And as long as you take good care of it, it will last you for years and you don't need to worry about buying it again. Canning is affordable, not necessarily easy, but it is affordable. And I hope, as you've seen in this video, it is absolutely doable. And there is no reason why, barring time and, other circumstances, there's no reason why anybody cannot go in the kitchen and get their canner out, get the canning, get the jars, get your ingredients, and get in there and start canning. And there's nothing like the comfort of having good home canned food in your pantry or in your cellar or wherever you in a closet. You can use a closet for to store your canned goods. You can use a cabinet in the kitchen. It doesn't have to be anything big and fancy, and it doesn't have to be a ton of stuff. You don't need to can tons of potatoes. You can can 4 jars. That's 4 jars that you didn't have, 4 jars that you have in the future. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. As I said, this is not a short video because this is not a short process. But I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you've learned something, and I hope it's refreshed your memory and maybe stirred you up into wanting to do more canning. And if you're an experienced canner, be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you're new to canning, leave all your questions in the comments, and good Lord willing, I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. So I hope to see you in the next video as we move on through canning and preserving season. In the meantime, keep on cooking, keep on canning, keep on baking, keep on cooking, baking, and canning from scratch. And the good Lord willing, I will see you again in another video. Take care, y'all. Bye.